This is part 2. The content that was covered in part 1 is grayed out, and in part 2 we'll be covering internal validity and construct validity. And then, because these videos can only be 15 minutes long, external validity will be covered in part 3. Internal validity pertains to this idea of causality. So if we have a relationship between two variables, we often want to the degree possible, understand whether one variable causes another or whether it's simply an association between these two variables. So if we design a study that seeks to establish this idea of causality to the degree that we are able to do so, we need to address these threats to internal validity. So the first threat is called temporal ambiguity, and that has to do, we need to establish that this cause preceded the consequence. So if we were looking at this relationship between smoking and lung cancer, to address this threat, we'd want to make sure that our data on smoking was data that was collected before that diagnosis of lung cancer. Back to our example of type 2 diabetes, that physical activity was assessed before that diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. So that makes sense. I think temporal ambiguity is pretty easy to understand. So let's move on now to this idea of selection, bias. So what we want to do is rule out these biases that can come from having differences between our study groups. And the easiest one to understand is let's say that you have one group that gets a treatment and the other group is the comparison. So selection bias can occur due to how you assign people to these study groups. For example, if you let people choose which group they wanted to be in, likely there would be a difference between people who chose to be in that intervention group versus chose to be in a control group. So that is why we often think of random assignment to treatment as a gold standard. Why? Because when we randomly assign someone to one group or the other, every person in your sample has an equal chance of being in one group or the other. So that's one way to address this bias, is how you assign people to be in one group or the other. Let's look at this second example here under selection. Sometimes when we do a study where we're comparing groups, we might select people with different characteristics that we put into these two groups. So for example, we have one group of women who have had infertility problems and another group of women who have given birth. And we notice that there's more depression among these women who have had infertility problems than those who have given birth. Well, we can't conclude that infertility causes depression because because of this issue of temporal ambiguity. So if we wanted to look at how depression relates to this idea of infertility or giving birth, you'd have to back up and collect that data on depression before women attempted to become pregnant, before that assignment to two groups. So you had this data on depression prior to those two groups naturally forming due to issues with fertility or infertility problems. The next bias is that of history. And history pertains to an event that occurs while your study is in progress and while you're collecting data. And the potential of that event to have an influence on your dependent variable. Have an influence that might mean then that there's something going on other than that independent variable that could have an effect on your study results. So for example, let's say you're studying the sleep position that mothers use when they put their infants to bed, when they lay them down in the crib. And while you're collecting data on sleep position among mothers, there's a big news release on a landmark study that was done that called into question that position that's being recommended for infants. And you would just need to be aware that that historical event of that news release could have an effect on your dependent variable. And how do you deal with that as a researcher? You need to, first of all, look out for those potential historical events, which are actually events that happen while your study is occurring, and make note of the time. And in this case, you would just have to be aware of the potential for that to have an influence on your dependent variable. One way to address this is in the design is to have a control group. In the example I did, that really wouldn't be feasible. But in some studies, the way that you can control for historical events is by having a treatment group and a control group. And in that case, that historical event should influence both of those groups. A confounding variable is a variable that influences a dependent variable, but it's not measured or otherwise controlled for in a study. And what this means is it could have an effect, but if you're not measuring it, then you can't account for it. And what that means is it has this potential to create a lot of noise, or to mean that your study result really isn't valid because you don't know the degree to which that's being influenced by this confounding variable. So, for example, let's say you're looking at this relationship between coping style and depression, but evidence suggests that this relationship could be influenced by age. And if you aren't accounting for age in your study, then you're not sure the degree to which age might be influencing your measures. So this is important to think about as a DMP student at this point in time, because you're going to be starting to search the literature. And one of the things you need to be aware of as you're doing this is these other variables that might be influencing those variables that you want to study. So and as you read that literature, what that means is not only do you pay attention to studies that include, let's say, those 2 or 3 variables that you're interested in, but as you're reading those studies, you need to make note of other variables that come into play in having an effect in those studies, and keep track of those. Sometimes we do have confounding variables that we need to consider that aren't showing up in the literature, but often they are showing up in the literature because other researchers have thought about those possible effects. So there are various ways, and what's important is that there are various ways that we can control for these variables when we design a study and the methods we're using. So the easiest way is sometimes to control for them in your statistical analysis, and certain analysis methods allow you to do that. Another way is to control for them when you do your sampling. And that means sometimes just narrowing your sample to exclude the potential influence of that confounding variable. So let's use this example of age. So if we have an age range, let's say people in their early 20s to early 30s, where there's a pretty consistent relationship between coping style and depression within that age range, you could use sampling methods that include that age range and exclude people that aren't in that age range. I think before we move on, it's important to define these terms of concept, operationalize, and construct. You've likely run into these terms at this point in your studies, and you will continue to run into them. So concept pertains to things that we can't directly observe, but we know they're there. So we can take someone's pulse and we can count their respirations. We can directly observe those. But we know that other things are going on that we can't directly observe, things like stress and pain. And what we want to be able to do then is to operationalize, that gets to the second idea, ways of measuring these. And so that's something that researchers do, is they figure out how can we measure things like stress and pain. And you'll find those measures in the literature. And hopefully you'll find good measures of some of those things that you want to measure that have already been operationalized. The idea of a construct is a little harder to nail down. I'm offering this definition here, offered by Pollitt and Beck, as this concept that's been invented by researchers so they can study a phenomenon that they're interested in. For example, locus of control, the idea that people believe that they control events that are important to them. So here we're going to talk about construct validity more broadly, as it pertains to these many elements that are in a study that need to be considered. Are you constructing these meanings in a valid way? I really like this quote in Pollitt and Beck, where they say the first step in fostering construct validity is being to carefully explicate, and that means to be able to explain and defend what is the treatment, what are these outcomes, in what setting is it, and what's your target population? How are you constructing those? So let's give an example here. So let's say, and we're right. I have a hard time getting. It's really hard. Okay, so here's the cursor. Now it's where I want it. So let's say you're studying an intervention among people who have mild depression and they live in rural communities. So here you have this construct of mild depression and rural communities. So how are you reaching? How are you defining mild depression? And how are you including in your target sample those people who fit that definition of mild depression? And can you defend how you're defining that based on the literature? Same for rural communities. How do you include people who live in how you've defined a rural community and exclude people who don't live in a rural community? Because there's often shades of gray in how those things are defined. So this is another thing that you should be paying attention to as you read the literature and become interested in variables you want to study, and think about those settings in which you'll do them, potentially interventions that are being used. So think about these things and pay attention to how those are being constructed in the literature that you're reading. And those are things that you need to be recording. It'll save you a lot of work later on to have those, to make note of those things.